I'm Elmariza Hinabi, one of the reporters of group number 3. My group mates are Tasinan Raymond and Manceras Adrian. So we will help you know more about the Sigmund Freud and his significant contributions that are still very useful nowadays. So please listen. But before we formally start our discussion, I will first introduce you to our contents. So our contents includes the introduction, the unconscious mind, the ideas, ego and the superego, the defense mechanism, the psychosexual stages, and of course the references. So let's get started. Who really is Sigmund Freud? Sigmund Freud died in London on September 23, 1939 at the age of 83. He died because of a lethal dose of morphine as the pain medication because he had suffering agonizing pain due to its inoperable cancerous tumor in his eye socket and in his cheek. So, let's move on to introduction. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 and was died in 1939, was the founding father of psychoanalysis, a method for treating mental illness and also a theory which explains the human behavior. So Freud believed that the events in our childhood will have a great influence on our adult lives, shaping our personality. For example, anxiety originating from traumatic experiences in a person's past is hidden from consciousness and may cause problems during adulthood. One of the Freud's most important contributions to the field of psychology was the development of the theory and practice of psychoanalysis. So we all know that psychoanalysis is the method for treating the mental illness. So when we are talking about mental illness, it talks about mind. So some of the major tenets of a psychoanalysis include the significance of the unconscious, early sexual development, repression, dreams, death, and life drives, and the transference. So now we will move on to the unconscious mind. Freud developed a topographical model of the mind whereby he described the features of the mind's structure and function. Freud used the analogy of an iceberg to describe the three levels of the mind. So what are these three levels of the mind? So here is the illustration of the unconscious mind, which is used by an analogy of an iceberg. So here you can see the conscious. It is the small amount of mental activity we know about. The subconscious, the things we could be aware of if we wanted or tried. The unconscious, the things we are unaware of and cannot become aware of. And the last one is the idea. Is part of the unconscious mind and comprises the two instincts, the eros and thanatos. So, what are these two? On the surface is consciousness, which consists of those thoughts that are focus of our attention now, and this is seen as the tip of the iceberg. The preconscious consists of all which we can retrieve from the memory. The third and the most significant region is the unconscious. Here lie the processes that are the real cause of most behavior. Like an iceberg, the most important part of the mind is the part that you cannot see, according to Sigmund Freud. So, Sigmund Freud emphasized the importance of the unconscious mind, and a primary assumption of Freudian theory is that the unconscious mind governs behavior to a greater degree than people suspect. Indeed, the goal of psychoanalysis is to make the unconscious conscious. So, let us move on to the psyche. The third content, the ID, the ego, and the superego. So Freud later developed a more structural model of the mind comprising the entities, the ID, ego, and the superego. These are not physical areas within the brain, but rather hypothetical conceptualization of important mental function. So what are these entities? The ID, ego, and superego have most commonly been conceptualized as three essential parts of the human personality. Freud assumed the ID operated at an unconscious level according to the pleasure principle or the gratification from satisfying basic instincts. The ID comprises two kinds of biological instincts, which are called the eros and thanatos. So what are these eros or thanatos? Let us spot the difference between the two. Eros or life instinct helps the individual to survive. It directs life-sustaining activities such as respiration, eating, and sex. The energy created by the life instinct is known as libido. So from the word itself, life instinct, it helps the individual to think of the things that will literally help him to survive in this competitive world. For example, respiration. If we will not breathe in oxygen and inhale it, we will die. If we will not eat for a long span of time, we will slowly die. So this eros is the instinct wherein it helps the individual to survive and to live this life in this world. In contrast to what I've said, thanatos or the death instinct, so it is the opposite of eros and is viewed as a set of destructive forces present in all human beings. This energy is outward into others. It is expressed as aggression and violence. So, for example, if a certain person will experience or an experiencing depression and he don't know what exactly the solution of this one, so he'll commit suicide. So that is one of the destructive forces that is caused by death instincts. So Freud believed that eros is stronger than thanatos, thus enabling people to survive rather than self-destruct. We all know that a certain person does want to survive rather than to die, because all of us wanted to live this life. We wanted to experience more things in our life. That's why we need to survive in this competitive world. So next page, you will see here the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. So we will get to know this all about. The ego develops from the ID during the infancy. The ego's goal is to satisfy the demands of the ID in a safe, a socially acceptable way. So the ego develops from the ID during infancy. So the ID serves as the commander of the ego because the ego's goal is to satisfy the demands of the ID in a socially accepted way. The ID is present at birth and represents everything that we inherit. From our parents, it is the source of our desires and impulses and is the primary component of our personality. This unconscious part of our psyche operates on the pleasure principle and seeks instant gratification with no regard for consequences or reality. So that is the ID. The ego arises from the ID and is developed as a result of our attempts to fulfill the ID's needs. It operates on the reality principle and serves as a mediator that strives for a compromise between what the ID wants and what the outside world can grant it. So in contrast to the ID, the ego follows the reality principle as it operates in both the conscious and unconscious mind. Lastly, the superego. The superego arises from the ego and acts as an internal representation of the moral values of the environment. So it develops during early childhood and is responsible for ensuring moral standards are followed. The superego judges what we should morally do or not do and guides us about the shoulds and should nots of our lives. The superego rewards us with pride and positive feelings upon doing good, and punishes us with feelings of guilt, shame, or fear for not abiding by values that we have for ourselves. The superego operates on the morality principle. So the basic dilemma of all human existence is that each element of the psychic apparatus, the ID, the ego, and the superego, makes demands upon us that are incompatible with the other two. Inner conflict is inevitable. For example, the superego can make a person feel guilty if rules are not followed. When there is a conflict between the goals of the ID not followed, when there is a conflict between the goals for the ID and superego, the ego must act as a referee and mediate this conflict. The ego can deploy various defense mechanisms to prevent it from becoming overwhelmed by anxiety. So, let us know what exactly are these defense mechanisms. So let's hear from Mr. Raymond Desenan as he will tackle us more about the defense mechanism that will help a person to prevent conflict from becoming overwhelmed from anxiety.
So let's proceed for defense mechanism. Defense mechanisms are the behaviors people use to separate themselves from unpleasant events, actions, or thoughts. These psychological strategies may help people put distance between themselves and traits or unwanted feelings such as guilt or shame. Defense mechanisms are psychological strategies that are unconsciously used to protect a person from anxiety arising from unacceptable thoughts or feelings. Next is the different defense mechanism. Under description and example. So first mechanism is repression. Repression is an unconscious blocking of unpleasant emotion, impulses, memories, and thoughts from your conscious mind. Example for this is a child who faced abuse by a parent. Later has no memory of the events but has trouble forming relationships. Second one is denial. Denial is a type of defense mechanism that involves ignoring the reality of a situation to avoid anxiety. Example for this is someone denies that they have an alcohol or substance use disorder because they can still function and go to work each day. The third one is projection. What is projection mechanism? Projection is a psychological defense mechanism in which individuals attribute characteristics defined and acceptable in themselves to another person. Example for this is a husband who has a hostile nature might attribute this hostility to his wife and say she has an anger management problem. The fourth one is displacement. Displacement is a defense mechanism in which a person redirects an emotion reaction from the rightful recipient onto another person or object. Example for this is a person who feels that their boss has been unfair may also fear being fired. If they complain or express anger, as a result, they may later shut out a family member. Displacement can have negative consequences for an individual and the people around them. The fifth one is regression. This defense involves returning to the earlier development stage when one faces stress or trauma. Some children may act as if they are younger again when they experience a sudden trauma or loss. Example for this is an overwhelmed child may revert to bedwetting or thumb sucking. The last part of mechanism is sublimation. Sublimation is a defense mechanism that involves channeling unwanted or unacceptable urge into an admissible or productive outlet. Example for this is a woman recently went through a breakup. She may channel her emotion into a home improvement project. Why do we need ego defense? We use defense mechanism to protect ourselves from feelings of anxiety or guilt. which arise because we feel threatened or because our id or superego becomes too demanding. Defense mechanism operate at an unconscious level and help ward off unpleasant feelings or make good things feel better for the individual. Ego defense mechanisms are natural and normal. When they get out of a proportion, neuroses develop such as anxiety states, phobias, obsessions, or hysteria.
Psychosexual stages. Freud proposed that we go through a series of psychosexual stages in predetermined sequence during childhood. These stages contain activities that revolve around a certain erogenous zone, an area of our body that is sensitive to stimulation. According to Freud, by successfully moving from one psychosexual stage to the next, we develop a healthy personality. Failure to resolve issues or getting stuck at any of the psychosexual stages will result in a problematic personality. The first stage of the psychosexual stages is the oral stage from 0 to 1 year old. During this psychosexual stage, a child derives a pleasure from oral activities such as sucking and tasting. Successful fulfillment of the child's feeding needs and proper weaning will result in the establishment of the trust. Too much or too little gratification can bring about oral fixation when the child grows up and can result in addictions such as drinking alcohol, smoking, overeating, or nail biting. The second stage of the psychosexual stage is the anal stage from 2 to 3 years old. The main source of gratification for a child during the psychosexual stage is the ability to control bladder and bowel movement. A positive and appropriate experience revolving around potty training encourages a sense of competence, creativity, and productivity. On the contrary, anal fixations can translate into obsession with perfection, extreme cleanliness, and control, or the opposite, which is messiness and disorganization in the adulthood. Next is the third stage of the psychosexual stage, which is the phallic stage from 3 to 6 years old. During this psychosexual stage, the erogenous zone is the genitals. Boys start to perceive their father as rivals for their mother's affections, while girls feel similarly towards their mother. Freud used the term the Oedipus complex to describe boys' attachment towards their mother, and Carl Jung later coined the term the Electra complex to describe the girls' attachment towards their father. The fourth psychosexual stage is the latency stage, from 6 years to puberty. During the psychosexual stage of development, sexual urges are usually repressed. Children spend most of their time interacting with same-sex peers, engaging in hobbies, and acquiring skills. Adults who are fixated at this stage are immature and have a hard time forming meaningful relationships. Next is the last stage of the psychosexual stage, which is the genital stage, from puberty onwards. During the last psychosexual stage, the erogenous zone is the genitals. Individuals' sexual urges are reawakened and are directed toward opposite sex peers. However, unlike at the phallic stage, the sexuality at the genital stage is consensual. People who completed the earlier stages successfully become well-adjusted, caring, and secure individuals at this stage, while younger children are mostly ruled by their ID and focus on their wants. Individuals at this stage have fully formed ego and superego. They can balance their wants with the reality and ethics. That's all for the psychosexual stages, and Thank you.